We're gathered here today for a presentation by Olin Joynton, retired president of ACC, who now joins us virtually. This is part two of a program. Part one involved the economic and fiscal effects of immigration. Today, we'll talk more about the racial, ethnic, cultural, social, criminal, medical issues of the immigration. And title of the program is Why Not Open Borders? Part two. Olin.
Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. And I'd like to encourage people to make comments or ask questions as we go along. You can use the chat function to do that, and Mike and Ron will be monitoring to see when the material comes in, and they will let me know what the questions are. So let's make it a back and forth rather than a monologue, and it's much more enjoyable for everybody that way. And then other time at the end, as long as people want to engage. Well, I wasn't sure that people would want to hear more about immigration after the first program back in December, but it turns out it did stir up some interest. The first program was limited to economic and fiscal topics deliberately, just so we could get some good focus on those aspects of the immigration issue. Economic means the effect of immigrants on our economy, specifically, just for the sake of simplicity, you can narrow down to one big number, which I'll show you in just a minute, how much the gross domestic product of the United States is thought to be influenced by the presence of immigrants. And by the way, immigrants will be defined as people in the United States who were born in another country. That's a rough definition. Well, it doesn't fit my other brother, Dan, who was born in Norway, but he became a naturalized American citizen. But economic impact also involves a lot of other things, such as labor force, workforce participation, that were covered in the first program back in December. My main source for both of these, both economic and fiscal, was about a 600 or 700 page study done by the National Academy of Sciences that involved 200 or 300 experts in economics and public policy makers and so on. So there are some other sources I used, notably an economist named George Borjas, who was born in Cuba, came to this country in 1962, and is considered to be the most authoritative, but best I can tell, economist on immigration today. Now, fiscal has to do with how many taxes immigrants pay, or how much they pay in taxation, versus how much they take from government assistance programs, all the way from federal to state and local. And assistance could be anything from police protection, roads, all the way down to health benefits and so on. So the most consequential slide from the last program is this one right here. The National Academy, and this is all based on National Academy of Science study numbers. According to them, the cumulative effect of immigrants being in the United States up to 2016, which was the latest year I could find information on, was a $2 trillion positive effect. In other words, the GDP in 2016, I don't know what it is today, was $2 trillion ahead of where it would have been if we did not have immigrants in this country. So that's a sizable number. I believe in 2016, the GDP was about $20 trillion, somewhere in that neighborhood. So you're looking at a 10%, a significant 10% increase in cumulative effect from the presence of immigrants. Now, that's the good news. The not so good news is that immigrants, again, people who were born in other countries, not their children or the children of their children, but just the immigrants themselves, but also their dependents, took 1.2 trillion more out of various government programs than they put into those programs or those levels of government by way of taxation. So when you hear complaints about immigration that immigrants are coming over here and taking more out of our government programs than they're putting in, yes, that is correct. However, if you put it in the context of the gains to our gross domestic product, the production of goods and services that wouldn't be possible if they were not here, according to the economists, then we still end up with a net gain of $757 billion. And so when I say why not open borders, I have been a little bit coy about whether that means that's a rhetorical question or a real question. And I was advised by a fellow, Erwin Salimos, who reviewed the slides for this program, that it would be a good idea and to level with you and tell you what my answer to that question is as a real question rather than just a rhetorical question. And so I will do that. He advised me to just let the cat out of the bag at the beginning and then say a little bit more about it at the end. But what I'm going to say at the end, my recommendation based on these two programs is going to be that we go back to some version of open borders that we have had in this country for most of the time of its existence. There have been some exceptions. Let's see, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first big legislation to try to restrict the control of immigrants that I know about. That was a response, a backlash, you could say, to the Chinese immigrants who began coming over here in large numbers with the gold rush in California, 1849, and stayed in order to contribute a lot of the labor force to the building of the transcontinental railroad system, which was completed in the 1870s or 1880s. By the way, the current issue of Smithsonian Magazine has an interesting article on excavation by archaeologists of a town in northwestern Utah that was occupied by Chinese immigrant laborers who worked on the transcontinental railroad. Let's see, but my topic here is for how many years in the United States have we essentially had open borders versus restriction on them? The next big effort to restrict people coming into the country was in the 1920s, and there were pretty significant racist reasons for the restrictions that came in then. That was a time when the Ku Klux Klan was surging in membership all over the country, and indeed in Indiana and Michigan, in the Midwest. It was quite strong in the 1920s. And also there came to be a so-called scientific eugenics movement among the best, most highly qualified and esteemed social scientists, and other types of scientists, anatomists of the time that pretty plainly or bluntly said that there are superior races and there are inferior races, and the Northern European and Anglo-Saxon races are superior and everybody else is inferior. So you had in the best universities over the country, the most highly qualified experts preaching this kind of stuff. So as a result of those two things, surging of Klan membership and the academic, the academy's support for these racist conclusions, you had big restrictions on immigrants in the United States in the 1920s. And essentially, if you weren't from Great Britain or Northern Europe, it was going to be very, very hard for you to get in. Those restrictions were taken off in 1965 as civil rights advances took place. And there's still restrictions in place, but for most, main point is for most of our countries exist, that in effect, we've had open borders. So that's a little glimpse of what's coming. Let's get into some of the material. One of my topics is racial categories. You can get a little more fine-grained than what I'm showing right here, but the four basic categories for the US Census are shown in this slide. What about the numbers? The most recent census, 76% non-Hispanic white. However, I came from Texas about 20 years ago, and I believe by the time I left, Texas had become a so-called majority-minority state, such that non-Hispanic whites had gone from a majority to a minority compared to blacks and Hispanics. Also of note, immigrant birth rates are higher than those for natives. A lot of the natives in our country, the millennials, I guess, are marrying much later than was true 50 to 75 years ago, or if at all, and they're having children, delaying or just deciding not to have children a good bit. So we are headed, if it weren't for the immigrants, a situation that has caused a lot of trouble in countries like Japan, some European countries, and even China itself, as it walked back from the one-child policy of 15 or 20 years ago, of a lot of adverse economic consequences if your birth rate doesn't at least keep up with the death rate. So it's immigrant birth rates that are keeping us away from that kind of trouble. This is a topic called American identity. Who are we as Americans? And that's a kind of a subjective topic that a lot of people can weigh in on, but the people, the sociologists, people who study this, historians, do say that we were essentially a WASP country in terms of how we identified ourselves until the Civil War. And then starting with the Irish immigration with the potato famine in the 1840s, that identity has broadened to be much more inclusive, as you see in point number two. I'd say in my lifetime, it's gone from it being an anomaly for a Muslim to be considered to be an American. I don't think I knew any Muslim Americans growing up, to now it's something that people accept and are not surprised by. Here in Kentucky, the Louisville International Airport is named for Muhammad Ali. So there's an example of inclusion But with the topic of diversity, there is a lot of interesting stuff. I'm going to just report a little bit on the research of Robert Putnam. Anybody know the most famous book by this author? Came out maybe 15 years ago. The title of his most famous book is Bowling Alone. And it describes how back 50 years ago, a lot of us remember this, there were bowling leagues and bowling together with your friends was an important form of social connection. Putnam's big research emphasis is what he calls social capital. And social capital is what gets built up when you have the more interactions you have with other people, and the more favorable you are, and the closer those interactions are, the more social capital you build up for yourself. And then if you get crosswise with other people, and in effect, you can spend your social capital. If you've built up a lot of it with some other people, and then you become a nuisance to them, you're spending that capital. So this is what he studied. And in the short term, his conclusion, a number of different studies he's done, is that social capital goes down when diversity goes up. It weakens the social fabric. Those are his actual words, at least in the short term. People participate less in civic affairs. They distrust each other more. They're less charitable. Their contributions go down. They do what he calls hunkering down. And it's interesting, not only between me and some group that's different from me, but it's also the social capital and the amount of trust goes down between me and members of my own group. And the explanation of that is if our society is becoming more diverse, and you and I are the same racial ethnic group, I might come to suspect that you're friendly with those folks, and I'm not ready to be friendly with them, so I'm going to trust you less. Anyway, that's some of the result. Fortunately, in the longer term, there does historically occur. It historically occurs that people settle down, get used to the diversity. There's an expansion, as we just seen with the national identity. How did that happen? We can learn from it. Assimilation does help. It's a controversial topic, and not everybody wants to be assimilated who comes here as an immigrant, but it is the most important force in reducing the reduction of social capital that Putnam studied, just mentioned to in the previous slide. English language spread, and also spreading the immigrants out is one of the remedies I read about. If immigrants are concentrated, as for example, Cubans are in Miami, you can come here as an immigrant and if in effect never stop being a Cuban, because if you settle in one of those enclaves, you're going to be speaking Spanish, you're going to be working for a fellow Cuban immigrant, you're going to be buying from a grocery store that's run by Cuban immigrants, you'll buy your insurance policy from a Cuban immigrant. It's called Little Havana, and there will never, at least in the first generation, be any kind of need or impetus for assimilating and becoming more in line with American national identity, becoming Americanized, so to speak. And you see some of the with distributions of immigrants with the idea of spreading people out. You'll see people from come over here from Thailand, for example, being settled in a small town in Kansas, where there's not a concentration, and apparently that's by design to promote assimilation. Let me pause here. Any questions or comments? Okay. Cultural contributions of immigrants. So we can all think of examples of cuisine, music, fashion.
We do have a question here.
Sure.
Just an observation, Dr. Joynton. I think our presentation would be much better if they would expand your picture on the screen a little bit. You're like a postage stamp there in the right-hand corner. Thank you.
Okay. You're talking about my picture or the slides? My picture? Okay, let's see. Mike, do you have any advice?
No, usually I think we have to pick between one or the other, and the speaker and the participants should show up on a small screen.
Okay, well, I would have a hard time if my picture covered up the screen. So unless somebody has a suggestion, I think we'll leave it the way it is, but I appreciate the observation.
Better already.
Okay, well, you can think of cultural contributions that come to be seen as American. Pizza, for example, fashions, cuisine, music, dance forms, and so on are all the kinds of things that immigrants have brought to our country. And the more widespread they become essentially part of American culture that is borrowed from culture of another country. Acquisition of English is a big deal with assimilation, and you see this pattern. When we lived in Texas, our next door neighbors were the Utilitarianists, and Victor and Angie, the couple who lived next to us, their parents didn't speak English. They were from Mexico. They spoke English well, but they also spoke Spanish, and some in the home. Now their children they had twin daughters who did some babysitting for us. I don't think they knew much Spanish at all. So we saw in our neighbors the trend that you're seeing right here in this slide. Another aspect of people becoming Americanized. With education, there's a difference between Hispanic immigrants and Asian immigrants. Maybe you've been able to observe this yourself. And the previous program had a lot of information on connection between education and economic well-being, education of immigrants and economic well-being. The high-skilled immigrants, many of whom are Asian, are business and academic leaders, and not so much with those who are less well-educated. Public health topic. The current law allows the United States to exclude from immigration people who have health problems that are enumerated, the four big ones in item number 2 here. This topic has been the source of frustration for me with trying to do my research for this. The interesting thing, item number 2 here, immigrants are healthier than natives on arrival. And there are a number of reasons for this. Self-selection means that maybe the sicker ones, or the ones with a larger number of health problems, stay in native countries rather than coming here. It takes, you've got to be in pretty good health to even think about immigrating. The exclusions themselves reduce the amount of sickness or increase the amount of healthiness among the immigrants. Immigrants, believe it or not, have better diets or are used to their traditional diets in their home countries are better than typical American diets. Just go down whatever street you're near that has all the fast food restaurants on it, you see what I mean. Many of them also have a high level of physical activity, and which is produces health. They have close family ties. The closer you are to your family, and the less, especially in many immigrant families, there are impositions of safety measures on family members, children coming up that take the children away from and the teenagers away from some of the health risks that American teenagers get exposed to at a greater level. Cultural norm buffering, same kind of thing. From a libertarian perspective, you might disagree a lot, or from an equal rights perspective, you might disagree a lot with the control that in some foreign cultures that are exercised over children or women. However, it does keep them safer in some ways, and the end result of that is greater levels of health. Of course, they come over here and they start riding around in cars and getting less physical exercise and eating at Taco Bell, and their health comes down to our level. Also, some studies have been done on the use of insurance. Some immigrants who can come here and get a job that includes health insurance or otherwise acquire it, use insurance a lot less than natives do. There's some cultural, religious, linguistic reasons why this is probably so. Let's see. An example of a religious one that I've heard about is prohibition against a woman being examined by a male physician. But this is the source of my frustration. There is something, the United States government, and guess what, folks? We all pay taxes for this database on how many immigrants are excluded for health reasons. And I tried to get a hold of this a number of different ways and never could. I got pretty steamed at this stage of my research, paying for something that there didn't seem to be any national security or even HIPAA reasons for me to not be able to get, but I couldn't. Well, enough of that soapbox. You may remember the tennis star, his problems coming into Australia based on health reasons or non-vaccinations. He eventually got into the country, went through a bunch of court processes and got deported, so he couldn't play tennis there. This kind of, not our country, but it's the kind of thing that does happen. Well, if we had open borders, the restrictions on illegal immigrants, you could approximate and say there wouldn't be any illegal immigrants, and the exclusions of immigrants from Medicaid, for example, and other health-oriented U.S. government-funded programs would not be there. At least that's a good possibility, in my opinion. Also, one of the remedies for trying to keep immigrant health care good, the Alpina's Free Clinic, private philanthropy. Is that clinic still going? I remember it was started up by, what's it, Steve Hammond? And let's see, Dr. Stibbets was part of that. Is it still going?
Olin, we don't think so. I'm
Okay.
not sure if someone knows more, but
Anyway, it was a
here's
good
a
thing when it
comment. Here's
started
a
out.
comment. Here's a comment, Olin, that says,
Yeah.
no, it's not active anymore.
Yeah, that clinic's been closed for a few years.
Okay, well, it was a good thing to get started. I'm sorry to hear it's closed.
Well, and Steve Hammond left town. He went to Oregon.
I see. Well, that sounds like Florence. He and your husband did some good work there for a while, which I appreciated.
Thanks.
Olin, could you center your camera a little bit better? You're kind of drifting off the screen.
Okay, well, yeah, I can't understand as I get older why people are so eager to see me, but I'll take it anyway. Is this any better?
Fine.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good. An example of sensitivity training, nursing program at Alpena Community College had some components of that. I was interested to learn about how, for an example is, if you a member of a Hispanic family, you go into the hospital and you have consultations with healthcare providers. It's not what we might be used to in other cultures where maybe the patient has a spouse or a son or a daughter or a parent, and the providers are interacting with one other person. The whole family comes in. The sister-in-law got an opinion about this, and the uncle from California is going to come in, and you've got 20 people in the room trying to deal with the patient's healthcare issues, and it gets more complex. And so our nurses at ACC were being trained on how it is that different cultures have different expectations in healthcare settings, and let's create a situation that's beneficial for the patient rather than having the healthcare providers be made uneasy and unable to do their best in that kind of situation. So, okay. How many people, does anybody need to be told who made these remarks? It was a campaign speech. Okay, well, nobody said they did, so it's self-evident as I thought it would be. So what about the criminal aspect of immigration? It's only the state of Texas that records arrest and conviction data with regard to immigrant status, and look at those numbers, folks. Our own native people have twice the level of arrest and convictions actually than the illegal immigrants. And the legal immigrants have only 1/3 the conviction level. So this characterization of immigrants as criminals is just the opposite of what these data show. Again, why not open borders? There is no reason I can see from these data for excluding people based on criminal trends. Yes, there is, and I'll get to that in just a minute, but in the remedies. Let's see, in the 2010 census, in line with what I just showed you, 1.6 immigrant males incarcerated versus 3.3, twice as many natives were incarcerated in this, that you would call this the high crime age range. And this is not just a fluke, it goes back to 1980. So guess what, folks? The presence of immigrants with their lower rates of conviction actually lowers the crime rate in America rather than increasing it. I thought that was pretty funny. Some alien removals by region. You can see by far the greatest number is North America. I don't have a breakdown whether it's Mexico, Canada, or United States, but you can see here more removals for non-criminal reasons than criminal reasons in item number 2, there are some criminal trends that are so definitely associated with certain other countries: terrorist cells, illegal drug trade, corruption of public officials, this scofflaw patterns. If you drive around in some cities, and you'll see people running red lights with abandon, and it is the subject of some studies I looked at that, just not paying attention to traffic laws and doing what you want to in traffic is typical of some immigrants from some countries, gangs and human trafficking. So my idea of remedies with regard to the criminal element associated with immigration would be, instead of a broad brush approach, look at some of these specific associations between countries of origin and these kind of problems. Ethics, there's a book that I don't have a real high regard for called Open Borders, the Science and Ethics of Immigration by Brian Kaplan. And what he does is to show every ethical system and every religious teaching goes in support of open borders. So these are the three, in philosophy anyway, the three most important, most prominent ethical theories. Utilitarianism, the right thing to do is what produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So you could imagine a case for open borders or more in immigration anyway, with that kind of approach. Deontology is essentially, at least in the work of Immanuel Kant, a version of the golden rule. And so you can imagine, if you were seeking a better life in another country, would you want to be welcomed in or not? And then the virtue ethics approach also could be made into a case for more immigration, if not open borders. Religious traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you all have what I would call strong traditions of hospitality. I'll just give you a chance to look at those 3 examples. So essentially what I'm arguing here, you can make a case for more immigration, if not open borders, based on ethics and religion. The topic also raises liberty and libertarian and sovereignty issues. I don't know the answer to question to number 1. I suspect a majority of people would say yes, or yes emphatically, to question number 2. Regardless of what other forms of expressing our sovereignty, our existence as a sovereign nation, controlling the borders is indispensable. Sovereignty of individual nation states in the global village seems to be on the decline. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. Nation states, there are a lot of autonomous zones trying to break off from what we thought were supposed to be nation states these days. The Tigray region in Ethiopia would be an example. The Kurds, who occupy parts of Syria and Turkey, I believe. in Ukraine, essentially the western part of the country has traditionally been Ukrainian, and the eastern part is dominated by Russian immigrants, people who are ethnically Russian. It was made the same country, at least in name. Is that a tenable process anymore? Yugoslavia was a creation, I think, after around the Second World War, that had 6 distinct racial and ethnic groups jammed together. Remember Czechoslovakia? Now we have the Czech Republic and Slovenia. So the process of trying to make a nation state out of jamming together different ethnicities, I'd say there are a lot of questions about that today. As there probably always have been. Well, don't get insulted by these questions. If you compared your own home to a nation, which it resembles in some ways, what about that person who comes to your door, knocks on it for a variety of different reasons that are typical of immigrants trying to come into this country? What would you do? Does that person have a right to be welcomed? Or are these comparisons fair? So this is just another spin on another approach to getting your mind around the ethical issues, I guess you could say, ethical and public policy issues. This is our first several slides on Dearborn, which I thought would be particularly interesting to the Michigan audiences. I guess many of you know about the situation in Dearborn and have visited it, as I have a couple of times, and looked at some of the Arab American cultural institutions there. The census is a little bit out of date, but I don't think it's changed that much in past 10 years. Very significant Muslim presence there. The largest mosque in North America, which is a Shia mosque. Now, worldwide, Shias are only about 10% of Muslims, but in Dearborn, they predominate. There's been vandalism and a bomb plot, not from Native Americans or Native residents, but from Sunnis, fellow Muslims. The whole process of Arab American identity is complex, as I say in the 4th point here, fluid, situational, and emergent. There are a number of voices in the Arab American communities who don't like the hyphenated version, and the idea of there's a pan-ethnic Arab American identity that is not accepted by a lot of people because they want to emphasize I'm from Yemen and I'm way different from somebody from Syria, for example. Dearborn initially got its Arab population in the 1920s from when there were Lebanese people who came over to work in the auto industry, specifically Henry Ford's River Rouge plant. That it goes back about 100 years to that migration. A lot of Iraqi or a group of Iraqi refugees were studied who were escaped from Saddam Hussein, and they were studied for their levels of PTSD. One of the interesting parts of that study, criticisms of it, is the study was done in a purely secular way and that completely overlooked the way that religion was very important to a lot of the subjects in recovering from the trauma of Saddam's regime and also having to flee it. The role of religion was just not factored in, but it was very significant for a lot of the subjects and kind of raised a lot of questions about the validity of the study. Some activity here aimed at the Muslims by Christian representatives. Just let you take a look at that. Most of the public officials there say that Dearborn's a lot better off because of the Arab American immigrants. Some of the benefits, beneficial effects you see in the first and second points here, both. A lot of improvement of a town in Michigan that was headed for real trouble before some of these organizations and concentrations of Arabs began to make these improvements. 9/11 saw a lot of suspicion, discrimination against Arab Americans. The response, though, on the part of many was to say Islam is not inherently at all violent or terrorist religion. It does have terrorist representations, but don't take a broad brush here. If you know a Muslim, you're less likely to have those prejudices. It's an interesting picture, and look at the date. Less than a week after 9/11, our president at the time, reaching out to Muslim Americans and validating the idea that it's inherently a legitimate religion and not inherently terrorist or threatening. So just about done here. I have come to the conclusion that returning to some version of open borders at least deserves a trial run. Some restrictions are in order, a limited term, maybe let's try it for 3 to 5 years is something I'd be interested in. I would vote for if I were in a position to do so. Then after you do a trial, pause it, and then look at what happened, and then resume, modify, or go back to border enforcement. I'll conclude with the question again, why not open borders? And thank you very much for your attention and participation.
Are you still taking questions or comments?
Yes. Mike? Do you have?
Yeah,
Yes,
do you
I
have
do.
something online there, Ron, or?
I have,
Mike, my wife Pat is next to me and she would like to make a comment or ask a question. Go ahead, Pat.
yes, as I was listening to this, I thought about a personal story of the way immigrants have changed or impacted the lives of others. I worked with a physician in Texas. So of course, the immigrants coming over were generally immigrants from Mexico and illegal, but no, I don't know how many of them were illegal, but the ones that ended up in the emergency room tended to be. And what he complained about was, yes, he had his own practice. He worked hard. He worked many hours, and it was hard for him to get time with his family. But often when he could get off to be with his family, he was called back in to the hospital. He needed to go. That was part of his job. and it would be for an illegal immigrant, mostly, he said mostly it tended to be pregnant women coming into the hospital to get really expert child care. Hospitals couldn't turn him away. He couldn't turn away going into and serving while he was needed. But he knew going into it, it was going to take his time, took him away from his family, and he knew he would never be paid for it, but he had to do it anyway. So that was just what came to mind as I was listening to this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pat. Anybody else?
David, you have, yeah, we have one here in Alpena, Olin.
Okay.
My first experience with open borders was in the 10th grade. I went to high school in Tucson, Arizona. I went to Pueblo High School, and I had an occasion to go to Nogales, Arizona, and Mexico a couple times while I lived in Arizona. But the open borders you're talking about, as I recall, it was a chain link fence with 4 or 5 strands of barbed wire over the top of the fence. I wonder if the wire's still there.
Well, I don't know. The wall was that was probably before the walls was started. By the way, the wall was started in the 1990s with President Bill Clinton, and construction was continued all the way through Trump by 2 Democrat presidents and 2 Republican presidents, paused by Biden. Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Olin, much of your research seems to point that the data is actually helpful to the American economy, the American public, or at least benign. How do we change the dialogue that's out there on some of this? Because it seems to be so polarized and demonized in many respects. Do you have any remarks on that besides what you suggested earlier about the assimilation and stuff, which is true?
Right. Well, make everybody join ALL and wise up from this kind of stuff. That's kind of self-centered, but let's see. Just personally, in encountering somebody who's very heated up about any subject, I tell your question is, how do we change the dialogue? And I guess you're referring to situations where the dialogue can get really ugly. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Well, one of the Stephen Covey 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is seek first to understand and then to be understood. Another is to don't take the bait. That's one of my biggest counsels to myself in that type of situation. Show respect and refrain from making accusations towards the other person. We've all heard about using I statements in situations rather than you did that and you did this, and going after the other person. When you express your own point of view, making sure the other person understands, well, this is where it looks, this is how it looks to me. That's what comes to mind, but I don't have a systematic program for changing the dialogue. What about you or anybody else in the audience? What else could we do?
Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that either, Olin, but it seems like the rhetoric and the heated rhetoric doesn't reflect any of the hard facts underlying any of it.
I will also say I recognize that immigrants cause a lot of trouble, and the people who were born here many have had very negative experiences with immigrants that might have even included assault or murder or property damage, and it would find it very hard to get to appreciate what I consider to be the overall beneficial effects, and even if you count in the negatives of immigrants being here.
Olin, do you think there's anything inherently wrong with ethnic neighborhoods?
Well, I'm not going to give a general answer. Well, yes. Is there anything wrong with ethnic neighborhoods? I do think that to the extent they lead to a separatist, us versus them mentality, to the extent that they would, for example, inhibit a process of a fellow from Belarus coming into this country and never learning English and never learning how to participate in the benefits of American life, economic life, social life, but staying within an exclusive Belarusian community, never venturing out. Yes, I think those are all harms that can come from ethnic neighborhoods. So I'll answer it yes. Are there some benefits to them? Sure, but I guess I will put my cards on the table and say assimilation rather than identity politics and trying to preserve customs that belonged to a different country, worked there. I think those are harmful to not only the individual, but our society.
So then do you think that we will actually be able to handle the assimilation over time? Like, what do you see the landscape changing in Texas, say, in the next 40 years? Will that situation kind of quiet down, or do you think we'll still be having the heated rhetoric and some of the violence that we have?
Well, decidedly, yes, based on our history. And I think if you go back to the national identity stuff I presented, we've gone from WASPs only are the true Americans to a much more inclusive idea. And I do believe that assimilation of people from different ethnic groups and coming from different cultures has helped that. I understand that if you can have pride in the country that you came from and want to pass some of your own traditions on to your children, that's fine to an extent. But if it prevents you from participating effectively, efficiently in American life, well, that's not so good. Having lived in Texas for 30 years before coming to Michigan, I saw a lot more harmony and positive interaction and beneficial contact among people of different backgrounds than I did strife and dissension, far more. And of course, the community colleges that I worked for down there were just an important nexus of advancement of opportunity for people who weren't wealthy or didn't necessarily have the best school background. Community colleges really, I saw, were clearinghouses for opportunity for people from many, many different backgrounds. And that sort of thing that I directly observed and participated in is a big source of my satisfaction with the privilege of being able to work for community colleges. So that was in Texas and it was real. And it was
Yeah,
extensive.
that sounds very encouraging, Olin. One of,
other questions from the Zoom group?
yeah,
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sort of trying to figure out exactly open borders, exactly what do you mean by that? How many people should we let come to our country? Do we still need some quotas? And do we say no to some people? I mean, what are your terms about that, Olin?
Oh, I could see, I don't know about quotas. There are no more quotas as there were before 1960, from the 1920s to 1965. There were quotas by country. There are none now. There are ways of immigrating legally. The most important one by numbers is you have a family member here. But I think the second most important one is you have a job skill that where there's not enough labor force in this country to fill the openings. But there are some restrictions. I'm not going to call them quotas, but there are some restrictions that make sense to me. The healthcare ones do. I can see, for example, a person who has a serious contagious illness being excluded from coming into this country until that problem is taken care of, or a person who refuses to get vaccinated, or a person who has a history of severe drug use. I can see restricting people based on a criminal record or associate or any kind of connection with the things that other countries are infamous for, such as human trafficking or violent drug gangs or terrorist cells. Those would be good reasons for keeping people out, in my opinion. But absent those kinds of things, allowing free flow, letting labor markets decide on a trial basis and then assessing it after 3 to 5 years is an interesting prospect to me. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it answers gives me some more things to think about. Yes.
Well, good. Thanks for the question, Florence. Good to
do we have anything else on Zoom? Any other questions from the Zoom audience? It doesn't look like it. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you, Olin.
You're welcome. Goodbye, everybody.